Welcome to this installment of the American Buddhist Studies Center's Introduction to Buddhism series. My name is Aaron Proffitt. I'm a professor of Japanese studies at the University at Albany, SUNY. My degree is in Buddhist studies, and Zen has been one of those things that has occupied a lot of my training and teaching, but also my own personal experience with Buddhism. So I'm excited to kind of give this brief overview. We'll touch on some things in the history of Zen as it developed in China, Korea, and Japan. And if there's time left, we'll talk a bit about modern Zen as well. Yeah. So in any case, let's jump right in. All right. What is Zen Buddhism? Zen is one of those terms that's just kind of in our culture. It's around. You have Zen rock gardens and Zen breakfast cereals, Zen corporate mindfulness retreats. Like Zen is just, it's everywhere. It's pervasive, right? But where did it come from? How did it become such a popular thing in American culture? Today, I hope we will kind of cover both of those things. So what is Zen exactly? Zen is a major lineage within East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. Now, in this lecture series, we have done Introduction to Buddhism, Life of the Buddha, Teachings of the Buddha. We've done Mahayana Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese, Japanese, etc. So now we're kind of focusing on this particular tradition as well, on Zen. So a major Mahayana Buddhist lineage. One of the issues that I'm really interested in my scholarship and my teaching is that we tend to study Buddhist traditions as if they are autonomous, discrete, and cut off from one another. Zen tends to be studied as if it were cut off from the rest of the Buddhist tradition, but it's not. And if you really spend time digging deeply into Zen texts, you quickly realize you need to have a high level of fluency in Mahayana philosophy, scripture, doctrine, history, practice, etc., in order to really kind of get under what the texts are trying to get you to understand. So Zen is also part of this interconnected environment, drawing upon various Buddhist sutras, various Buddhist traditions, and really, kind of overlaps with a lot of the other things we might see in the Mahayana world, whether it's esoteric Buddhism or Pure Land Buddhism, Tiantai philosophy, etc., etc. So in any case, the word Zen is the Japanese term for Chan, and Chan is a Chinese translation of the Sanskrit word dhyana. Okay, so in India, in Sanskrit, there are certain forms of concentration and meditation we may refer to as dhyana, kind of deeper levels of meditative absorption, we might say. Dhyana was then rendered phonetically in Chinese with two characters, chana. Okay, so dhyana, jhana is a Pali term. Chana, you can see how these kind of sound similar, right? So the term gets shortened to just chan in China. In Korea, the term is pronounced something like son. In Vietnam, it's pronounced something like tin, it's spelled like tien, but I think it's pronounced closer to tin. And then in Japan, it's pronounced zen. So same Chinese character, same concept, same lineage history, but pronounced slightly differently in these different countries. But Chan or Zen, I'll be using the word Zen because for most English speakers, that is the term you know. When I lived in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, there's a Zen Buddhist temple, and it's actually a Korean Son temple, but they call the temple the Zen Buddhist temple because nobody knows what Son is, but everybody knows what Zen is, sorta, right? So that their kind of presentations, hey, it's all Zen. Yeah. So that is that's the term I'll be using for the most part, kind of off and on in today's lecture. One of the interesting things about Zen or Chan in China is that it really arises through the confluence of Indian Buddhist culture and indigenous Chinese culture. Chan or Zen is very Chinese and it's very Buddhist, and it really is really kind of a product of how when Chinese culture became Buddhist. When I teach my seminar on Zen Buddhism, many of my midterm papers I get from students are, people saying, wow, Zen's actually kind of Taoist in some ways. And they say, well, everything in East Asia is kind of Taoish, let's say, and everything is kind of Buddhist as well, including Taoism, which is kind of interesting. But again, so when we think of Zen in relation to other East Asian Buddhist traditions, when we think of Buddhism in relation to other East Asian religions, whether it's Taoism, Confucianism, Shinto, or whatever, everything overlaps with everywhere. Everything overlaps with everything somewhere, right? So we can kind of think of it as as a tradition that's embedded and connected with other things as well. Okay. Zen Buddhism often looks to this handsome fellow pictured here, Bodhidharma. He's got big popping eyes and a beard, kind of I imagine, some medieval Chinese artist kind of imagining a stereotyped image of what an Indian person, would look like in their imagination. In any case, Bodhidharma, if he was in fact a historical individual, lived perhaps around 500 or 600. And represents, in some sense, an archetype of a particular kind of Indian meditation master who made his way to China and taught people. So there are many different teachers like that. And Bodhidharma, I think, is in some sense kind of a symbol for that type of meditation teacher. Zen is often referred to as the teaching outside the scripture. Okay, and this is this idea that through meditation, you gain direct insight into the Buddha's mind. You gain direct insight into the nature of reality. Whereas if you just study with the scripture, you get the Buddha's words, but you don't necessarily get the Buddha's mind, right? So that's the idea behind Zen, it seems. But East Asian culture is a hyper-literate culture, right? A lot of writing, literature, poetry, philosophy, government documents, right? A hyper-literate culture. And within this hyper-literate culture, some of the most important poets, scholars, philosophers, writers of things have been Zen monks. When we think of a monk, we sometimes think of someone who's off in the mountains, the misty mountains, separated from the world around them. But in fact, monks were often embedded in complex social, political, economic, and other cultural flows. And, in some cases, Zen monks are the ones who are, spreading Confucian philosophy to different parts of East Asia, or serving as kind of cultural diplomats between different regions. So when we think about what a Zen monk was in other different periods of East Asian history, we really have to kind of expand our imaginations, because the picture is a little more complicated than you might think. So, classic Zen phrase, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? So Bodhidharma, if he was in fact a historical individual, died perhaps around 530. Within the Zen tradition, he is looked to as the 28th patriarch of the lineage, and the 28th Indian patriarch and the first Chinese patriarch. So the kind of mythic backstory goes something like this. It's called the flower sermon. Once upon a time, the Buddha Shakyamuni was giving a lecture, and he held up a single flower and sat in silence. And everyone's confused, or waiting for him to speak. But one disciple, Mahakashyapa, he smiled. And then that's when the Buddha knew that he got it. He got the big picture. He got the essence of the teaching. And that began the first transmission of the mind-to-mind transmission beyond the scripture. So in some sense, you could think of Zen as an esoteric secret lineage being handed down, master to disciple, right? In some Christian traditions, they talk about apostolic succession, meaning that your priests, teacher goes all the way back to Jesus, okay? Well, in Buddhism, Zen has something like that as well. Like every Zen master, their teacher, all the way back goes to the Buddha. Okay, so that's kind of one of the ideas within the Zen tradition is lineage. Okay, at the beginning of my Zen seminar, I asked my students, when you hear about the word Zen, what's the first thing you think of? And they'll say, oh, yoga, meditation, peace, rock gardens, things like that. By the end of the class, they think of lineage. And I asked the same question again. And now that you hear the word Zen, what do you think of? Like, oh, it's all about lineage, right? So think about this succession of patriarchs, teacher, all the way back to the Buddha. Okay, Bodhidharma in later times came to be associated with the Shaolin Temple. There's a lot of mythology around him, founding, inventing Kung Fu. In fact, so Bodhidharma is supposed to be from South India. So there's even a South Indian Tamil kung fu movie about Bodhidharma. Google it. It looks awesome. In any case, so Bodhidharma, again, he's kind of this archetype for a type of meditation master that came from India and went to China. And one of the famous stories, he meets Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, and Emperor Wu, paraphrasing here, look at all, Emperor Wu says, look at all these temples that I've built, look at all these monks that I've fed and clothed. What good merit I have accrued, what good karma I have received. And says, tell me about that. And Bodhidharma's like, nothing, like none of it matters, like nothing matters, and the emperor's like, well, just who are you? And Bodhidharma's like, nobody. Nothing special, right? This is not exactly the answer that the emperor was looking for, and Bodhidharma goes off and kind of does his own thing. Here he is, engaging in what's called wall contemplation. That term wall contemplation is actually a little more complicated than that, but let's, he goes into a cave and he meditates for a long time. And there are some traditions that say that he meditated for so long. Zen has lots of fun, gruesome stories. I'm going to tell you a couple of them today. Right? So according to some traditions, Bodhidharma was sitting, looking at his cave, meditating for a long time, and he kept like getting drowsy and falling asleep. So he cut off his eyelids. Right now, did that literally happen? No, but it doesn't matter. But it kind of paints a picture of intense dedication to meditation. Right. The funny thing is that, in many periods of Buddhist history, you have these great meditation masters that really want to get away from the world. They want to go do their own thing, live in the wilderness, be by themselves. The problem is that people really dig that. They're like, oh, this guy's like, he's above it all. He's different. And then they become very popular, right? Okay. Kind of, funny how that works. People are coming and trying to get Bodhidharma to be their teacher. One student who we know is Hui Ke, his name Huyke, Hui Ke. He comes, he's like, master, please don't take me as your student. Bodhidharma kind of, looks at the walls like, and Hui Ke waits and waits and waits, and he's out there so long, kind of showing his dedication. The snow is piling up, and then eventually he cuts his own arm off and offers the hand to Bodhidharma. And if you look closely at this image, the arm that he's holding out is not attached to his arm, right? He's holding this as an offering, at which point Bodhidharma accepts him as a student, him having, dedicated his, demonstrated his dedication. Great stuff. Yeah. So again, did this really happen? Doesn't matter. Who cares? But there are a lot of these great stories within Zen that kind of impart this deep, intense dedication, even to the point of, sacrificing life and limb. Yeah. Okay, here's this famous verse we often associate with Zen, the teaching outside the scripture. A special transmission outside the scriptures. Do not rely on words and letters. Directly point to the human mind, see one's nature, and become Buddha. Right, so this is a classic verse that we often associate with Zen. But remember, many people have taken this highly literally. To think that now we don't, if we have Zen, we don't have to rely on scriptures or whatever. We don't have to read anything. We don't have to study. And I have met, purported Buddhist masters who have told me, yeah, I don't read. I don't care. It's all about meditation. It's all about my practice. But historically, that has not been how this is understood. I like to think of it kind of like jazz. And there are various jazz musicians who have talked about how Buddhism has impacted their practice. But think about like jazz. You learn all the forms, you learn all the scales, and then you can forget them, right? But you have to put in the work first, and then you're able to kind of let go and be free of all that. And I think that there's something of that in the Zen tradition as well, that you learn your scriptures, you learn the philosophy, you learn the practice, you learn the forms, and then you're able to kind of let go, right? So I think that's one way of kind of contextualizing this in actual Zen practice. All right. The early phase in the history of Zen, and some of this breakdown of the history of Zen that I'll be presenting, I'm drawing upon John McRae's book, Seeing Through Zen. John McRae is one of my favorite scholars of Zen. I've built my own Zen seminar around his book, Seeing Through Zen, and I highly recommend it. I really like his rules for Zen studies, like how you're supposed to kind of cultivate an appreciation of the kind of mythic, historical, or mythistry presented by the tradition, but also, kind of have a bit of skepticism about some of the claims made as well. But so what I'm trying to present here is, to the best of our knowledge, what some scholars are talking about. The proto-Chan phase. This is Chan or Zen before Zen. This is before there's any kind of lineage consciousness. Now, whether or not Bodhidharma was a real person, Hui Ke was probably a real person. There seems to have been community around him and different meditation traditions in multiple locations in northern China that, in retrospect, we can see how they became the thing that we now call Chan or Zen. The practice of meditation is often focused on uncovering or revealing one's Buddha nature. There are some texts that talk about the sun disk contemplation. Now, you see this in the Pure Land Contemplation Sutra. You see this in Esoteric Buddhism. You see this in Zen. This is an early practice where, it's like you're envisioning a sun disk at your heart center. That's kind of like a symbol for one's Buddha nature. Okay. There's, like I said, lineage is really central to Chan, but in this period of the development of this tradition, there doesn't seem to be a clear sense of lineage, right? But there are kind of approaches to meditation that become important in the later tradition, right? There is some independent attestation. Now, in the study of world religions, often all we have are the texts from within a community that make certain claims about that community. And, unsurprisingly, we tend to be fairly skeptical of those types of claims. But in this case, there seem to be other documents and other texts, not from within these groups, that are like, hey, like there are these interesting meditation masters going around and taking this interesting approach. There were some Buddhist masters like Zhi on Mount Tiantai who were skeptical of these guys who were all about meditation, because Zhi is all about a balance. The Zhi in the Tiantai tradition is all about balancing study and practice. You have to have both. Those are the two wings of the little Buddhist birds. In order to fly straight. And that lineage seemed to think that some of these meditation masters that eventually become Chan masters are focusing a little too much on meditation. Whereas the Chan tradition has the opposite view, that you guys are studying too much and not practicing enough. So this is an interesting tension through the history of Chan and Zen and so on in Korea as well. Right. Now we have one of the classic Buddhist texts, the Platform Sutra. Technically, the Platform Sutra is not actually a sutra. It is a text composed in China that tells of one of these great Buddhist masters. They have these great Chan masters. Now, Chan masters are understood to be Buddhas, right? To have, to be awakened. So if a Buddha, gives a teaching, then that becomes a sutra, I suppose. So depending on how you think of it, you could certainly think of this as a sutra, right? So the kind of hero or protagonist of the Platform Sutra is this monk Hui Neng, who is the illiterate cook at the Huangmei community. We sometimes call this Eastern Mountain Chan. And Hui Neng is walking through the market one day. He hears somebody chanting the Diamond Sutra, and he's like, "Wow, that's really cool. I want to know more about that." So he goes to go work at this temple. While he's working at this temple, this illiterate Southerner, and I really like when Southerners upset things. But okay, so Hui Neng is walking, and he sees that someone has written something on the wall. Apparently, according to the text, the great master of the temple, Hongren, who is the fifth patriarch of the Chan lineage, had decided that he would use a poetry competition to choose the successor, to choose who would be the sixth patriarch. Platform Sutra is sometimes called the Platform Sutra of the sixth patriarch. Now, at this time in the temple, everybody knows that Shun Shou, Shun Shou is the straight A student, the obvious successor. So there's like no competition. Shun Shou writes his verse on the wall, and everyone's like, "Oh, of course he's going to get it." Whatever. But Hui Neng is not hip to that, and he's walking by and says, "Hey, what's this say?" Someone tells him what it says, explains that there's a poetry competition, and Hui Neng's like, "I have an idea. Could you write this up for me?" And he contributes his verse as well, and These two verses, which I'm going to show you in a moment, are said to represent the distinction between the northern school and the southern school, the path of sudden enlightenment and the path of gradual enlightenment. Let's take a look at these verses real quick. Shen Shou's verse reads, "The body is the tree of wisdom, the mind a bright mirror in its stand. At all times take care to keep it polished. Never let the dust and grime collect." Right. So this is a vision of Buddhist practice that requires constant practice. Right. You work diligently and purify the mind. Think of purifying a mirror. Now, back in ancient times, people believed that mirrors didn't just reflect, but that mirrors were actually self-luminous. Right. So that makes this image a little more potent, a little more relatable for how we think about Buddha nature as this self-luminous, this self-illuminating aspect of our being. Right. Hui Neng's verse in response is, "Wisdom never had a tree. The bright mirror lacks a stand. Fundamentally, there is not a single thing. Where could the dust and grime collect?" This is a different view, this kind of spontaneous awakening view, that it's not practice that makes you a Buddha. You perhaps already are a Buddha. And the practice way of kind of allowing that, kind of getting out of your own way, you could say. Now, like I said, these two verses are often presented as if they represent two distinct forms of Buddhism, two distinct approaches, but actually they go together. Okay. Now, the reason that we have come to think of them in this way, as representing two distinct kinds of Buddhism, two distinct schools, the northern and southern school, is because of this character Shen Hui. Now, I know these names are similar, and that's tricky, right? But so Shen Hui is someone who came later, who presented themselves as the successor of Hui Neng, was a very charismatic Chan Zen evangelist. Okay, even impressing Empress Wu in the year 700. And he presented this narrative that we find in the Platform Sutra as, I am the successor of Hui Neng, the real sixth patriarch. You guys are the gradualists of the northern school, and we're the sudden awakening tradition of the southern school. And for a long time, people took that to be the history of Zen. Scholars now have a much more skeptical view of that. This is polemics and rhetoric, kind of as different lineages are jockeying for position and political power and patronage and all this stuff. But it's a really fun story, and has been really influential in how people have thought about Zen. But there are multiple ways to look at the story and think through it, and think it through and understand its role. All right. So this period that we associate with the Platform Sutra, we could think of as the period of early Chan. This is when things are starting to kind of coalesce, come together. We have various loosely defined factions or groups with different approaches to the contemplation of mind. Or why am I pointing here? It should be here, the heart center, right? Contemplating mind, was it Guanxin, right? Contemplating the mind, right? The early phase we think of associated with Bodhidharma. In this phase, we see associated with Shengren and Shen Shou. The connection is not always clear, right? But this is a period when a theory of lineage, as Chan being associated with lineage, begins to take shape. And this period of Chan, of the development of Chan, is relatively well documented. This picture here is a recreation of what was said to be the mummy of Hui Neng, right? Mummification practices are something that have been associated with Zen. This is a practice that still exists in parts of China today, where a great master will, have their body dehydrated and then covered in gold or lacquer or something like that, right? Because the master is a concretization of enlightenment within this world. I think that's really, really interesting. Right. Next, we have the Middle Chan period. This is one of the, let's say, less historically attestable periods of Chan history, even though it's later. This is a period we often associate with Ma Zu, Shi Tou, Lin Ji, Xue Fengzun, and others. Some of the great masters that, what we could do full lectures on just them. If you have not already read the Record of Lin Ji, you should. Parts of it are hilarious and awesome. See him sitting there with that happy face and that balled up fist. One of the literary devices we see in the stories associated with Lin Ji is him smacking his students to kind of shake them out of their complacency to awaken them. This is a period we associate with the encounter dialogues. These are teacher-student conversations, of witty repartee, wherein they kind of reveal their awakening, their awakening experience, or they're challenged by their teacher in a way that surprises them, and kind of allows them to let go of their attachments and see things as they are. One of my favorite stories from this period is, a master is or a meditator is sitting there, he's meditating very diligently, he's got a bead of sweat coming down. He's, doing so good at meditation. Teacher walks by and says, "Hey there, buddy, what are you doing?" And the student says, "Oh, well, I'm trying to meditate so I can become a Buddha." And the teacher's like, okay, right. So then the next day, the student is walking through and he sees the master sitting there polishing a roof tile with clay roof tiles off the top of the temple. He's polishing it up. And the student says, "Master, respectfully, what are you doing?" And I says, "Oh, I'm polishing this tile to make a mirror." Okay. And he was like, "Master, I don't think you can do that. I don't think you could polish a tile to make it into a mirror." And Master goes, "Exactly. And just like you can't meditate to make yourself a Buddha." And immediately the student is awakened, right? Now, this story serves various purposes, but it's this idea that awakening is not a thing that you get. It's already present. You just need to kind of get out of your own way, and that's part of what practice is supposed to do, is to get out of your own way. And the teacher's job is to kind of surprise you, right? One of my favorite parts in the record of Linji we have pictured here, yelling at the student or whatever, and one student gets mad and yanks him down from the platform, and he's delighted, like, "Yes, like you're acting spontaneously, you're challenging me." And then he gets the student, student's up there and he speaks, but then the student hesitates, so he smacks him and pulls him back down again, or something like that. It's really great. Here's the thing, though. This so-called middle period Chan is largely known to us through later Song Dynasty records, a time when the so-called classical age of Chan is kind of invented. So a lot of what we think about here is, let's say, literary creation that helped to kind of instill in people's minds what Chan ought to be, which is often different than what Chan actually was. We talk about Song Dynasty Chan, right? So this is a period when Chan institutions and lineages flourish and come to dominate Chinese Buddhism. In East Asian Buddhism today, in China, Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, the top monks at most temples are going to have a Chan lineage connection. Okay, after a certain point in Song Dynasty history, state-run temples have as their abbot a Chan monk. Right? So Chan is very successful in this kind of rhetoric of enlightenment. We don't have to worry about India being far away or these texts being hard to understand, because we're making Chinese Buddhas here and now. And this is kind of the rhetoric that Chan is presenting during this period of Chinese history. And it's during the Song Dynasty that the literature we associate with the Tang Dynasty, which is the period before the Song, it kind of emerges. And Tang Dynasty, Golden Age Chan ideology presents these kind of witty, spontaneous masters. But the reality was, these state-run institutions that are highly ritualized, right? So there's this kind of tension between the literary ideal and then the lived practice of what, temple life was actually all about, right? Many scholars used to read this literature about the Tang very literally, and see and imagine that the Song Dynasty was a degenerate age of ritualization, etc. But actually, it appears that the Song Dynasty was the true golden age, because it's within the Song Dynasty that the golden age of Chan is imagined through the literary production, right? This is also the period when the encounter dialogues, like the teacher-student conversations and debates, becomes, the study of this literature becomes kind of key to the monastic curriculum. You study the great conversations that the great masters had with one another, because, the student of a great master ends up becoming the great master of the next generation, and so forth and so on, right? So the studying of the dialogues of masters within your lineage becomes key to the development of Chan identity. Yeah. All right. We'll talk briefly about Son in Korea. Like I said, the Chan lineage, in particular, the lineage of Linji Chan, becomes the dominant lineage in much of East Asia, and this includes Korea. But some interesting developments in Korea make it a little bit different. Like I said, so in China we call it Chan, in Korea we call it Son, in Japan we call it Zen. Is introduced to Korea perhaps around the 6th century or so. It really starts to grow in popularity during the 9th century. It's a really interesting period of development, perhaps what we'll get into at a different time. We'll talk about some of the basic practices. And this is not just for Korean Zen, this is for Zen across the board, whether it's Chan in China, Son in Korea, Zen in Japan. The thing that we call Zen, the seated meditation component, is just one piece of a broader curriculum of many different practices you might engage in throughout your life, throughout the day. Different communities, different teachers may emphasize different things at different times for different audiences. Again, Zen is a form of Mahayana Buddhism. There's a lot to draw upon. Mahayana is the great vehicle. There's a lot of texts, a lot of different philosophical traditions you can kind of build with in your practice. So one of the core practices is bowing and prostrations, right? When you see a Buddha image, you bow. When you see your master, you bow. And this is an act of humility. This is an act of kind of putting the fundamental Buddhist concept of no self and interdependence into practice, right? To bow is to be self-effacing. To bow is to perform an act of humility. Yeah. Of course, we have seated meditation, the thing that we call Zochan in Chinese, seated meditation, or Zazen in Japanese, right? So seated meditation is part of it. Then we have Gongon practice. In Japanese, we call this koan practice, right? So Gongon practice. This is kind of the study of these encounter dialogues between masters and disciples. You could be chanting different mantras, chanting dadani. So a mantra, it's like a thing that you chant, Om Basada Datoban or something like that. And then a dadani is like a mantra but longer. Like a dadani might be a paragraph or a page long, whereas a mantra might be one line long. One of the most popular practices in East Asian Buddhism, and Chan is one of the dominant traditions of East Asian Buddhism, is the Great Compassion Dadani of the Bodhisattva of Compassion. The Bodhisattva of Compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, is said to save beings in all forms of, to save beings from all manner of difficulty. And you chant the Great Compassion Dadani as kind of a way of building a connection with this Bodhisattva. It's a very common practice. Another thing is in Korean, Yombo, which is Nianfo in Chinese or Nembutsu in Japanese. This is the chanting of the name of the Buddha Amitabha. Pronounced in Korean, Namu Amitabha. As well, one might engage in sutra study, the recitation of sutras, the copying of sutras. So sutras are a very important component of Chan life, whether it's the Heart Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, Avatamsaka Sutra, etc. In Korean Buddhism, for a variety of reasons we don't have time to quite get into, the Avatamsaka Sutra has been one of the most important text. Some great Buddhist philosopher once said that the Avatamsaka Sutra is Zen in theory, and Zen is the Avatamsaka Sutra in practice. So they've been understood to have a very important, intimate relationship. This is especially the case in Korean Buddhism. One of the most, if not the most important Son practitioner, Korean Zen practitioner, is Jinul. I have a picture of this book, Tracing Back the Radiance, Jinul's Korean Way of Zen by Robert Buswell. Robert Buswell is the authority on Korean Zen, and if you're interested, I would highly recommend you check out his book, The Zen Monastic Experience. That is, in my opinion, one of the best books for really getting a picture of what Zen, especially in Korea, is all about. Jinul promoted the kind of synthesis of this idea of sudden awakening, that an awakening is not a thing that you kind of cultivate and make happen over time. It's kind of mechanistic view, but rather it's spontaneous, right? Naturally rising. It kind of connects this with the Avatamsaka Sutra, which really promotes this idea of everything being interconnected with everything else, right? He also argued that there's really no conflict between meditation and study. Remember, sometimes people said, "Oh, you meditators are not studying enough," and some scholar amongst like, "Oh, and some meditators like, oh, you guys study too much, you don't meditate enough." Jindal is one of these people that really shows that there's no real conflict between the two. I think this is one of the themes we find in Korean Buddhism in general is kind of smoothing out the edges, right? Seeing how everything actually all fits together. Maybe this is the influence of the Avatamsaka Sutra that's focus on interconnectedness, right? He also emphasized the balance between sudden and gradual, right? That there's practice that leads to these kind of recurrent moments of awakening. He promoted Kanhua in Chinese, which is observing the key phrase. This is kind of the, let's say, the punchline of some of these encounter dialogues. One of the most popular ones that I think many Americans have heard of is the, what is the sound of one hand clapping? One of the ones that's very popular in Korean Buddhism is, what is this, right? Or simply the contemplation of the character mu, which is emptiness or shunyata. Yeah. Many people look to Jindal as having established the foundation of contemporary Korean Buddhism, right? So this great practitioner and scholar of the Chan tradition, or Son in Korea, that really kind of influences the whole of Korean Buddhism today, especially and is seen as the founder of the Songwangsa Temple on Mount Joge. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about Japanese Buddhism before we finish up. Japanese Buddhism was transmitted so Zen Buddhism is transmitted to Japan at a time when Tiantai philosophy and esoteric Buddhism, or tantric Buddhism, is the dominant form of Buddhism. So the lens through which Zen is transmitted is very intimately connected with esoteric Buddhism. Do check out our lectures on Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism to get a better idea of that. And then here soon we'll probably do a video on esoteric Buddhism. So esoteric Buddhism was a major influence on early Zen. Many early Zen monks were specialists in Shingon or Tendai who then went to China and studied Zen, or studied with Zen masters in Japan who had gone to China to bring back this new stuff. Important people who contributed to the formation of the Zen tradition, like Enni Bennen, Muju Ichien, Keizan Jokin, were all kind of specialists who, in these esoteric traditions, who were then kind of influenced by Zen as well. Right, so Zen transmission rituals, right? A teacher-disciple relationship is really key. This is, in a sense, an esoteric transmission of these secret teachings of the true nature of Zen. Yeah, and there are tantric transmission lineages. They list the masters that include Zen masters, and the other way around. There are Zen lineages that include the names of great tantric masters as well. So there's a lot of overlap. This is true in China. This is even true in Tibet, apparently, according to a recent book called Tibetan Zen. So esoteric Buddhism and Zen have often had this interesting overlap, and it's my understanding there's a book that will be coming out on that topic very soon. So one of the key founders of Japanese Zen is this monk named Eisai. Eisai was born into a family of Shinto priests. He then goes to train on Mount Hiei, which is basically like the Vatican of Japan at the time. It's like a major institution, major land-holding institution with its own like standing army and serfs and slaves and all this stuff. And anyway, so he's working his way through the Kenmitsu, or esoteric curriculum. He was also an influential Tendai esoteric master, a Taimitsu master, but he also was interested in what was going on in China. So he goes to China and he studies, he collects Tiantai texts in China, or Tendai texts in China, studies Chinese tea culture. He's often credited with introducing green tea to Japan. I don't know if that's true, but that's one of the stories associated with him, as well as lineage affiliation in the Linji Chan tradition, which we know in Japanese as Renzai Zen, right? So Linji Chan in Chinese, Renzai Zen in Japan, same word, just pronounced a little bit differently, okay? The traditions we often associate with Renzai are the koan practices. Now, sometimes you'll hear people in English say koans, but that's not how you pronounce it. It's koan in Japanese, gong'an in Chinese. One of the popular ones of a later Renzai master, Hakuins, what is the sound of one hand clapping? We could do a whole episode just on Gongan practice. It's really interesting, very subtle. The encounter dialogues, the word Gongan means public case, or koan means public case. And it's these kind of dialogue between teacher and disciple where a teacher is not explaining the truth of Buddhism, but is demonstrating the truth. So trying to surprise or push the student to think about Buddhism in a different way. So not explaining a Buddhism to you, but showing it to you, right? Show, don't tell type thing, right? One of the other ones that I think is really classic is does a dog have Buddha nature? Right, these two disciples are having a conversation about a dog, and says, Sensei, does a dog have Buddha nature? And in this koan, the master says mu, which could be read as the master saying no. But wait a minute, all sentient beings have Buddha nature. So the master said something that's a contradiction. What do you do with that? Right. So in this one, it's sometimes been explained that the point of this koan is to get you to think differently about enlightenment. Enlightenment or Buddha nature is not a thing that you get. It's reality that you have to awaken to, which is a different way of thinking about it, right? So in this case, the teacher is saying something intended to surprise you, to make you think of it, that make you think differently about something you think you know about, okay? So that's kind of the point of koan practice, is to study these dialogues and come up with a response to them, right? Teacher might ask you a question, and you have to respond to the question, not as a way to, pushing up your glasses and say, well, here's the correct answer. Like, not to give the answer, but it's not in what you say, but rather how you say it. I guess you could say it's kind of are you thinking beyond the text, right? So anyway, that's kind of one approach to Renzai. But again, Renzai is kind of embedded within all these other Buddhist traditions, connected with all these other things. Includes seated meditation, koan practice, especially in this early period, esoteric rituals, and so on. One of the other great Zen masters of this time period in Japan, medieval Japan, is Dogen. There was a movie came out about the life of Dogen. If you want to go check that out, it's just called Zen. But pretty straightforward. Like Eisai, he was a Mount Hiei monk, but apparently had some issues with the way things were done and wanted to find something else. Right? He's one of the many people who either wanted to go to China or dropped out or did something else from this time period, who really changed Japanese Buddhism. So first he studies Zen at Kenninji under Myozen, who was one of Eisai's disciples, but then eventually decides to go study in China himself. He travels to China with Eisai's disciple. The form of Chan that he studies is in a slightly different lineage. Again, all these things are connected, but it's called Cao Dong in Chinese. But in Japanese, it's pronounced Soto. So we often associate Dogen with the Soto Zen lineage. Okay, so Cao Dong Chan is Soto Zen in Japanese. He establishes Eiheiji and has really come to be recognized as a dynamic and creative philosopher. The Soto tradition we often associate with Zazen, seated meditation, or Zuochan in Chinese. And Dogen, one of Dogen's famous phrases is shikantaza, or just sitting, right? Shikantaza, just sitting. And one of the ideas we associate with Dogen is the notion that enlightenment is not a thing that you make happen. Rather, practice is not mechanistic. Practice is about expressing your innate Buddha nature, right? So meditation is not about becoming a Buddha. Meditation is about being the Buddha that you already are. I think that's really an interesting idea. Japanese Zen comes to become a powerful presence in the medieval period. Some people have attributed this to kind of the simplicity of Zen, although many of the Zen masters are in fact doing a lot of these esoteric rituals and trying to compete with other trying to compete with the earlier esoteric lineages by actually doing a lot of these esoteric rituals. And one of the cool things that Soto Zen Buddhists do in later periods is they kind of go into the countryside and take over these older temples, that maybe don't have a priest, and they'll keep doing whatever the people are already doing, whether it's reciting the Lotus Sutra, saying the name of of Buddha Amitabha, esoteric rituals or whatever. But now it's a Soto Zen temple too, right? So again, these things are often overlapping. And it's my understanding that Soto Zen monks used to even go to Koyasan, one of the great temples associated with Kukai and the Shingon Buddhist tradition, up until the post-war period. And then apparently some Soto Zen monks, in the administration decided, we shouldn't hang out with the Shingon guys so much. We should do our own thing, do our own meditation retreats. But I just think that's kind of cool how, again, these things are always kind of overlapping.